of the brutal air war over the Eastern Front in 1944, there was just one Soviet fighter that could make German pilots think twice before engaging in a dogfight below 15,000 feet, and that aircraft was one of the smallest, lightest, and most unlikely fighters of the entire war. On the 16th of July 1944, 8 Yakovlev fighters intercepted a formation of 60 German aircraft over Byelorussia. According to Soviet claims, in the ensuing dogfight, the Luftwaffe lost 7 aircraft, including 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, without a single Soviet loss. 2 days earlier, 18 of these same fighters had clashed with 24 German aircraft. The Soviets claimed 15 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of just 1 Yak damaged. Whether these numbers were accurate or not, one thing was undeniable. The Luftwaffe had noticed. Within weeks, an extraordinary order was issued to German fighter units on the Eastern Front. Avoid combat below 5,000 meters with Yakovlev fighters lacking an oil cooler intake beneath the nose. They were talking about the Yakovlev, a fighter constructed partially from plywood and birch, powered by a derivative of a French engine from the 1930s, and built in a country that had been on the brink of total collapse just 2 years earlier. Was the Yak-3 a masterpiece of pragmatic engineering, or simply the product of Soviet desperation? The answer, as it turns out, is both. To understand the Yak-3, we must first understand the chaos from which it emerged. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, the Red Air Force, the VVS, was caught catastrophically unprepared. Within the first week, Soviet losses exceeded 2,000 aircraft. Many were destroyed on the ground before their pilots could even reach them. The fighters the VVS did manage to get airborne were, for the most part, hopelessly obsolete. The I-16, I-153, and early MiG-3s were outclassed by the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109Fs and the formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190. But there was one Soviet fighter that showed promise, the Yakovlev Yak-3. Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev, born in 1906, was not a typical Soviet aircraft designer. Before the war, he had built racing planes and sports aircraft. In 1938, he won a Soviet government competition for a new fighter design with his I-26 prototype, which would become the Yak-1. What made Yakovlev's approach different was pragmatism. While other Soviet designers pursued all-metal construction and complex systems, Yakovlev understood the realities of Soviet industry. Aluminum was scarce, skilled labor was limited, production facilities were being evacuated eastward ahead of the German advance. The Yak-1, which entered service in 1940, was a hybrid. Its fuselage was built around a welded steel tube frame with the rear section covered in plywood and fabric. The wings used wooden spars and ribs with plywood skinning. This mixed construction saved precious aluminum while allowing rapid production using traditional woodworking techniques familiar to Soviet craftsmen. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. By 1942, as the Battle of Stalingrad raged, Yakovlev's design bureau was refining the formula. The Yakovlev had proven itself capable, but Luftwaffe fighters still exhibited significant advantages in speed, climb rate, and firepower. The answer, Yakovlev believed, lay not in more complex systems but in simplification and weight reduction. In late 1942, his team began work on a prototype designated Yak-1M. The letter M stood for Modifirovaný, meaning modified, but this was no mere modification, it was a radical reimagining. The wing area was reduced from 17.15 square meters to 14.85 square meters, a reduction of nearly 15%. Every component was scrutinized for weight savings. The oil cooler was relocated from the chin position beneath the engine to the wing roots, one of the key visual identifiers that would later allow Luftwaffe pilots to distinguish this new threat. The fuselage was shortened, the rear section previously covered in fabric now used plywood for improved aerodynamics and structural integrity. Armor protection was improved, a reflector gun sight replaced the older telescopic model. Chief test pilot Petr Mikhailovich Stefanovsky flew the first prototype on the 28th of February 1943. His assessment was unequivocal. He recommended that the new fighter should completely replace the Yak-1 and Yak-7 in production, with only the longer-range Yak-9 retained for further development. This was high praise, but the aircraft still needed a more powerful engine. The solution came in the form of the Klimov VK-105 PF2, an improved version of the liquid-cooled V-12 engine that powered most Soviet fighters. The VK-105 itself was derived from a licensed French Hispano-Suiza 12Y design from the 1930s, a lineage that French mechanics serving with the Normandy-Neman squadron would later find reassuringly familiar. With manifold pressure increased from 1,050 to 1,100 millimeters of mercury, the engine produced 1,290 horsepower. State trials revealed impressive gains. Time to 5,000 meters was reduced by 0.1 seconds. Takeoff run shortened by 15 meters. Speed below 2,400 meters increased by 56 kilometers per hour. The new fighter was designated Yak-3, and in March 1944, production began at plant number 292 in Saratov, maintaining the factory's average monthly output of 250 aircraft. The Yak-3 measured 8.5 meters in length, with a wingspan of 9.2 meters. Empty weight was just 2,105 kilograms. Maximum takeoff weight, 2,697 kilograms. To put this in perspective, the Yak-3 was lighter than the Supermarine Spitfire, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. It was one of the smallest and lightest major combat fighters fielded by any nation during the Second World War. Armament on the first 197 aircraft consisted of a single 20mm Schwach cannon firing through the propeller hub and one 12.7mm Berezin UBS machine gun synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. Subsequent aircraft received a second UBS machine gun, bringing total firepower to 2.72 kilograms per second using high explosive ammunition. This was lighter armament than most contemporary fighters, but weight was everything. The Yak-3's power-to-weight ratio of 0.35 kilowatts per kilogram gave it extraordinary acceleration and climb performance. Maximum speed was 646 kilometers per hour at 4,100 meters. More importantly, it could reach 5,000 meters in just 4 minutes and 30 seconds. A complete 360-degree turn took 17 seconds. But there were compromises. Combat range was only 550 kilometers. The cockpit offered minimal protection, just an armored seat, back and windscreen, and the plywood construction, while practical, would prove troublesome in certain conditions. Nevertheless, by mid-1944, the Yak-3 was ready for combat. The question was, would it live up to its promise? The Yak-3 began reaching frontline units in June 1944, just as the Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, was getting underway. Service tests were conducted by the 91st Fighter Aviation Regiment of the 2nd Air Army, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Kovalyov. The regiment's mission was clear: gain air superiority over the battlefield. The Soviet pilots, many of whom had flown the Yak-1 and Yak-9, immediately noticed the difference. The Yak-3 was faster, more agile, and climbed like nothing they had experienced before. Soviet pilot Boris Eremin would later recall, "The best fighter was the Yak-3, an ideal machine for a fight. Just a fairy tale. You fly one, and you cannot convey your satisfaction with it." Ivan Gaidayenko, another VVS pilot, agreed. "I think that of all of the planes that were in the war, the best were Yaks, especially the Yak-3. If an experienced pilot were flying one, it was impossible to shoot him down. They were so maneuverable." The aircraft's baptism of fire came quickly. On the 16th of June 1944, 18 Yak-3s engaged 24 German aircraft in a massive dogfight. According to Soviet claims, they shot down 15 German aircraft, losing 1 Yak destroyed and 1 damaged. Luftwaffe activity over that section of the front reportedly ceased the following day. On the 17th of July, 8 Yaks attacked a formation of 60 German aircraft, including Junkers Juppé-87 Stukas and their escorting fighters. Soviet claims stated that the Luftwaffe lost 3 Juppé-87S and 4 Bf-109Gs without loss to the Yaks. Now, we must approach Soviet victory claims with appropriate skepticism. Throughout the war, all sides overclaimed victories in the heat of combat. Multiple pilots might attack the same aircraft, and each claim a kill. An aircraft trailing smoke might be claimed as destroyed when it actually limped home. But even accounting for overclaiming, the pattern was undeniable. The Yak-3 was proving devastatingly effective in low-altitude combat. The reason lay in the aircraft's specific strengths. Below 4,000 meters, the Yak-3's lightweight and excellent power-to-weight ratio gave it superior acceleration and maneuverability compared to German fighters. It could outturn the Bf-109 and outclimb the FW-190 at these altitudes. Soviet pilot Ivan Kozymiako explained, "The only type of yak which was better than a Mesa in full and without reservations such as speed, vertical and horizontal maneuvers, and acceleration dynamics was the Yak-3. Another pilot recalled, "In a dogfight for all intents and purposes, a Yak-3 was superior to the Bf-109, especially during verticals. The Germans were afraid of it. The Fw-190, Germany's rugged fighter bomber, fared no better." Pilot Sergei Kramarenko noted that the Yak-3 could get behind the tail in one turn and shoot it down. The Luftwaffe was not blind to these developments. The frontline intelligence reports began filtering back to headquarters. This new Soviet fighter, distinguishable by its wing root oil coolers and absence of a chin radiator, was proving extremely dangerous in low-altitude engagements. The result was that extraordinary order issued to Luftwaffe fighter units avoid combat below 5,000 meters with Yakovlev fighters lacking an oil cooler intake beneath the nose. This directive, whether official policy or tactical guidance, represented a significant psychological victory for the Soviets. For the first time in the war, German pilots were being told to avoid combat with a specific Soviet fighter, but the Yak-3 was not invincible. Its limited range, typically just 40 minutes of combat time from takeoff to landing, meant it could only be used as a tactical fighter operating close to the front. Escort missions for bombers and long-range patrols were reserved for the Yak-9D, which had nearly double the fuel capacity. A Soviet pilot, Vasily Lembutsky, recalled, "The Yak-3 had little fuel. This aircraft was only for air-to-air combat. Yak-3s were very bad at escorting bombers. In these cases, we flew the Yak-9. The Yak-3's light armament also proved limiting. While the nose-mounted cannon and 2 machine guns were adequate for fighter-versus-fighter combat, they lacked the punch for ground attack missions against hardened targets. Pilots attacking trains or armored vehicles were at a distinct disadvantage, and at least 2 French pilots from the Normandy-Neman squadron were lost while attacking armed trains. Then there were the structural issues. The plywood surfaces that made the Yak-3 light and easy to manufacture had a troubling tendency to delaminate when the aircraft pulled out of high-speed dives. The combination of aerodynamic stress and moisture infiltration could cause the glued plywood layers to separate, weakening the structure. Soviet ground crews became adept at repairing this damage, and the plywood construction actually made field repairs easier than all-metal aircraft. One VVS mechanic recalled, "The most advanced machine during World War II was the Yak-3. The work of ground crews was generally time-consuming, but the Yak-3 was much easier and more convenient." German ground crews who examined a captured Yak-3 in January 1945 agreed. Luftwaffe test pilot Hans-Werner Lerche noted the perfectly crafted plywood ring around the fuselage, observing that it could easily be repaired even at forward aerodromes with improvised equipment. The pneumatic system used for landing gear flaps and brakes, typical of all Yakovlev fighters, was another source of frustration. Though less reliable than hydraulic or electrical alternatives, it was retained for weight savings. Perhaps the Yak-3's most celebrated service came with the Normandy-Neman Regiment, a unit of Free French pilots flying with the Soviet Air Force. The squadron, formed in 1942 from French pilots who had escaped Vichy France, had flown Yak-1s and Yak-9s throughout 1943 and early 1944. In August 1944, they were re-equipped with brand new Yak-3s. For the French pilots, many of whom had previously flown Spitfires with the RAF, the Yak-3 was a revelation. Warrant Officer Roland de la Poipe, who had scored victories in hurricanes over North Africa, wrote, "With the Yak-3 we had at last a fighter able to compete with the Fw-190 and Me-109, was even outclassing them under 4,000 meters where we most often had to fight." The Normandy-Neman pilots flew the Yak-3 through the final year of the war, from the liberation of Lithuania to the siege of Königsberg. They would score the last 99 of their 273 confirmed victories in the nimble Yakovlev. One Normandy pilot, Maurice Dessein, exemplified the bond between pilots and their aircraft. On the 15th of July 1944, while relocating to a forward airfield with his mechanic squeezed into the rear of his Yak-3, a fuel leak spewed into the cockpit, temporarily blinding him. Ordered to bail out, Dessein refused to abandon his mechanic, Lieutenant Vladimir Bielozub, who had no parachute. He attempted to land but crashed, killing them both. They were buried side by side, their graves adorned by local children with red, white, and blue flowers. Such sacrifices were not uncommon. The brutal air war over the Eastern Front claimed pilots and aircraft at a staggering rate. Total Yak-3 combat losses were 210 aircraft, 60 in 1944 and 150 in 1945. Given that nearly 5,000 were built, this represented a loss rate of roughly 4.3% of total production. Soviet pilots flying Yak-3s claimed kill-to-loss ratios approaching 10-1, though these figures must be viewed with caution given the widespread overclaiming on all sides. What is beyond dispute is that the Yak-3 gave Soviet pilots a fighter that could meet German aircraft on equal terms at low altitude, something that had been sorely lacking in the early years of the war. In January 1945, the Luftwaffe captured an intact Yak-3 when a Soviet pilot made an emergency landing at a German airfield in East Prussia. Test pilot Hans-Werner Lerche was assigned to evaluate it. Due to poor weather and the rapidly deteriorating military situation, Lerche's assessment was limited. But what he did observe impressed him deeply. Before beginning test flights, Lerche briefed Field Marshal Hermann Goering on the captured aircraft. He told Goering that due to the Yak-3's extremely low weight, coupled with its excellent aerodynamic qualities and powerful engine, you can expect an excellent rate of climb and combat qualities at low altitude compared to our fighters Bf-109 and Fw-190. After several test flights, Lerche confirmed his initial assessment. The Yak-3 was at low altitude superior to Germany's frontline fighters. But by then it didn't matter. The Luftwaffe was rapidly running out of fuel, pilots, and time. As the war ground toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, Yak-3 production continued. A variant designated Yak-3P, armed with 320mm Berezin B-20 cannons, entered production after the war. 596 were built, though none saw combat. Other experimental variants included the Yak-3 VK-107A, powered by an uprated engine producing 1,649 horsepower and capable of 720 kilometers per hour. However, the VK-107 suffered from severe overheating problems, and only 48 production aircraft were built. The Yak-3U, fitted with a radial Schwetzhoff ASH-82 FN engine to avoid the cooling issues of the VK-107, proved successful but was completed after the war ended and never entered production. The most exotic variant was the Yak-3RD, fitted with an auxiliary Glushko RD-1 liquid-fuel rocket engine in the tail, providing 650 pounds of thrust. On the 11th of May 1945, it reached 782 kilometers per hour at 7,800 meters. The test pilot was killed when the aircraft crashed 3 months later, and the project was abandoned in favor of turbojet development. When the war ended, production of the Yak-3 continued until August 1946. Total production reached 4,848 aircraft, making it one of the most numerous late-war Soviet fighters. When Stalin personally thanked the pilots of the Normandy-Neman regiment in June 1945, he offered them an extraordinary gift. 40 Yak-3s of the aircraft they had flown into battle were presented to them to take back to France. The French pilots flew their Yaks all the way from Moscow to Paris, fated at every stop along the way. These Soviet-built fighters, constructed partially from Russian birch and plywood, would form the nucleus of France's post-war air force. It was a fitting tribute to an aircraft that, despite its humble materials and modest origins, had proven itself in the crucible of the Eastern Front. So, was the Yak-3 a masterpiece or merely the product of desperation? The honest answer is that it was both, and that's precisely what made it so remarkable. The Yak-3 represented pragmatic Soviet engineering at its finest. Alexander Yakovlev understood that the perfect was the enemy of the good. He built an aircraft that Soviet industry could produce in large numbers, using materials that were available, with systems that could be maintained under the most primitive conditions. The plywood construction, often derided as a sign of Soviet backwardness, was actually a brilliant adaptation to circumstances. It saved critical aluminum, simplified production, and made field repairs easier. Yes, it had problems with delamination, but these could be addressed by competent ground crews. The limited range, rather than being a fatal flaw, simply meant the aircraft was employed in the role for which it excelled: short-range interception and tactical air superiority over the battlefield. The light armament was adequate for fighter-versus-fighter combat, and keeping the guns on the center line made the aircraft more accurate than rivals with wing-mounted weapons. What the Yak-3 possessed, more than anything else, was the right combination of characteristics at the right time. In 1944 and 1945, as the Red Army advanced westward, Soviet fighters needed to dominate the low-altitude battlefield, scrambling quickly to intercept German fighters and ground attack aircraft. For this mission, the Yak-3 was ideal. Its combat record speaks for itself. Though exact figures are difficult to determine, The Yak-3 achieved a remarkably favorable kill-to-loss ratio. Soviet pilots loved it, German pilots learned to respect it, French pilots flew it all the way to victory. The Yak-3 remained in Soviet service until 1952, though by then it had been eclipsed by early jet fighters. The Soviet Union supplied Yak-3s to Yugoslavia and Poland after the war, where they served into the early 1950s. Today, several Yak-3s survive in museums around the world, including examples at the Vadim Zadorozhny Technical Museum near Moscow, the Military Aviation Museum in Virginia Beach, and the Museum of Air and Space in Paris at Le Bourget Airport. Since 1991, 21 replica Yak-3s, Yak-7s, and Yak-9s have been produced using the original Soviet plans and tooling, though powered by American Allison V1710 or Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines rather than the original Klimov V12s. Several of these aircraft are airworthy, mostly in the United States, with others in Germany, Australia, and New Zealand. In October 2011, William Whiteside, flying a modified modern production Yak-3 UPW powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2000 engine, set an official international speed record for piston-engined aircraft in the under 3,000 kilogram category, reaching 655 kilometers per hour over a 3-kilometer course at the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. The following day, he pushed the record to 669 kilometers per hour. The Yak-3's influence extended beyond its service life. It established design philosophies that would influence Soviet and Russian fighter development for decades. The emphasis on maneuverability over firepower, on simplicity over complexity, on tactical agility over strategic range. These priorities can be traced directly back to the lessons learned with the Yak-3. Modern Russian fighters from Sukhoi, Mikoyan, and Yakovlev continue to prioritize maneuverability in ways that sometimes baffle Western observers. This tradition has its roots in the Eastern Front, where nimble fighters like the Yakovlev proved that, under the right circumstances, a lightweight dogfighter could dominate the sky. Is the Yak-3 the greatest fighter of World War II? No. That title belongs to aircraft with greater all-around capability, longer range, heavier armament, and more sophisticated systems. But was the Yak-3 the right fighter for the Soviet Union in 1944 and 1945? Absolutely. It was an aircraft born from necessity, refined through combat, and built by a nation fighting for its survival. It was made from birch and plywood because that's what was available. It had limited range because Soviet factories couldn't produce enough fuel tanks. It had a French-derived engine because that's what Soviet industry could manufacture reliably. And yet, despite all these limitations, or perhaps because of them, the Yak-3 became one of the most effective fighters on the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe, ordered to avoid combat with it below 5,000 meters, was not propaganda. It was a grudging acknowledgement of reality. When a Yak-3 met a Bol 109 or FW 190 at low altitude, the Soviet fighter had the advantage. In the end, the Yak-3 stands as a testament to what can be achieved when talented engineers are given clear requirements and the freedom to meet them with the resources available rather than the resources they wish they had. It was not a wooden wonder despite its plywood construction. It was a wooden wonder because of it. And that, perhaps more than any kill ratio or speed record, is the Yak-3's enduring